So yeah, my name is Sam. I'm the co-founder and CTO at Oso. And so what Oso is all about, really like the big vision for us is, we're trying to make security more approachable, more engaging for developers. And so that's actually what's effectively going to be my talk is about today. We want to make security something that is, an everyday concern for developers because it's fun and people are excited to make it work. And so that's the bar I'm trying to hold myself to today for this talk. So yeah, the more specific of what I'm talking about is access control patterns in Python. Here I have an outline of what I want to talk about. So I'll start out just by giving some of the sort of basic terms and definitions. What is authentication? What is authorization? And then I want to go through, what we've seen in our experience and having spoken to at this point, over a couple of hundred companies, what we've seen is really best practices for implementing authorization, in particular in sort of a B2B web application. And then the final piece of this will be showing you how to apply some of those techniques in a Django application. And for the app, we'll be using our product Oso, which I'll talk about later. But that's not really the main point. Like you'll see the sort of patterns and things that you can apply are generalizable across any Django app and any application at all. Okay, so people often talk about authentication authorization. So authentication is all about who you are. So you log in with your device, you maybe enter your username and password, something like that, and then the website identifies who you are. As you log in and says, okay, yeah, I know who you are. You are now username Sam. After that point, then comes authorization. All right, so now that I've authenticated you as Sam, what can Sam do? Maybe Sam can read document 12, can't read document number 4. So this piece on the right would be authorization. Looking at an example that hopefully most of you are familiar with, and it's a bit more realistic, GitHub. So on GitHub, you go to the website and you go to log in and you enter your username, maybe your email address and password, and then GitHub's like, cool, you are Sam Scott 89 in my case. Again, this piece is the authentication piece. Now that it knows that I'm Sam Scott 89, what can I do inside GitHub? So for example, if I try to visit these 2 URLs, one of them to list the Oso HQ organization teams and one to list the Django organization teams. Now, because I am part of the Oso organization, it's pretty happy to let me view my teams, but I'm not part of Django, so it's saying, no, you can't see any of those teams. And so here is the authorization, right? So within the GitHub application, what is Sam Scott 89 allowed to do? What things can he see? And this piece here, specifically the what can you do inside the app, the authorization, is what I'm going to be focusing on today. So at this point, you might be wondering, okay, like, why should I care? Like, what is it about, what is it about this area that, why are you building a product like this? What does this get me? Where's this going? So I think there's kind of 2 main reasons. So, I mean, yes, security is important. And I do think any developer of an application wants their application to be vulnerable and to have, in this case, you might have heard about this Twitter event earlier in the year where an attacker was able to compromise some credentials and use those to have some pretty wide access inside the Twitter app. And there are like hundreds and hundreds of examples out there you can find, everything ranging from servers which had no authorization whatsoever, various different, certain, API methods or something which didn't have the, appropriate access control. Sort of one of the more entertaining ones I've seen in the wild is users were able to delete other users' bank accounts because it didn't have the proper access control there. And this one at the bottom, which is actually partially redacted from HackerOne, the US Department of Defense had some, an admin panel which didn't have proper authorization controls and was vulnerable through that. So, these are vulnerabilities that happen time and time again, and it's not through, any particular bad practices or, saying anything about the individual developers or projects these people are working on. It can just be very hard to do authorization consistently everywhere and just always get it right. But for me, this whole topic isn't just about security. Like, that's not the main thing that I think is what makes it so interesting, because a lot of the time, authorization, the example I showed you for GitHub earlier, it's really about enabling your users to do things inside the application. You're never going to have everything wide open. You're going to have some amount of ability to only see pieces of data. And so how do you configure that to give your users the best experience and to be able to have that level of control? Now, the problem is authorization, it's not typically something that we've seen people often start out on the right foot. It's something that more often than not looks like this. You kind of ad hoc come up with some permission scheme along the way, maybe pull it out into some kind of methods to try and like add some structure to it. But really, it's just a lot of if else statements, checking a various bunch of properties, and it kind of gets to a point where it can be very, very hard to maintain. Imagine you want to change any one of these different checks, you're gonna have to go through and find the 12 different places to apply that. And so teams end up, companies end up with these permission systems that are very hard and inflexible to manage and easy to kind of miss things. And so again, a very like common pattern that we've seen out there going and talking to people is that they have these sort of waves of authorization system refactoring. So the one I'm showing on the screen here is from the Gusto engineering blog post where they spoke about this 10-month-long refactoring process they went to add granular authorization to their app. And this is like super, super common. It's normally kind of waves of this. Like you start off with something simple, you hit a point where you need something more, and you revisit it again, and so on and so on and so on. Maybe 3 or 4 different times, each one taking longer and longer. And so this is the real problem that I'm kind of trying to cover today and talk about is how can you start off on the right foot, design your authorization system in a way that is sort of more maintainable, it's easier to do the things like correctly. Okay, so let's talk about roles. So admittedly, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with roles. First of all, what I mean when I talk about roles. So the term people often use for this is called RBAC, or role-based access control. The general idea is, in your application, you have some number of users and some number of things they can do. Now, suppose you want to try and control who can do what inside this application. This is potentially a way too many things for us to try and deal with. So instead, what we do is we sort of group those users by some intuitive concept of, either who they are or the kinds of responsibilities they have inside the application. So, the majority of users are regular members, and we have some class of people who we say are admins because they need to, do some administration inside the application. And so kind of once we've done that grouping, the nice thing is we can just forget about just how many users there are. We apply permissions to those roles. So role-based access control is this kind of process through assigning users to roles and then roles to permissions. So maybe you say members can read and write, and admins can additionally delete as well. Again, so here is another kind of concrete example from from practice. This is a kind of a slice of the matrix that GitLab has in their documentations for roles. And you think about something like GitLab, and there is a huge number of things you can do there. It has the the version control stuff and managing repositories, but there's also CI pipelines and package management, container registry, all this kind of stuff. There's a ton of things to do, but they've still put this into just 5 roles. And those roles kind of give you a sense of what you should be able to do inside, say, the repository organization, right? So a reporter can report, they can create issues, but a developer can develop, they can edit and maintain the code, things like that. So there's sort of a few things that we've identified as, I'd say, kind of best practices for role systems like this. The first is that you should try and keep this at a small number of them as possible. And so when I mentioned I had this like love-hate relationship with roles, the hate part of this is when companies quite often end up with these giant permission matrices, 50 by 50 matrices or something, trying to tell you what you can do inside an application. And this is maybe people's experience with them when they've gone, when they're bad and when they're painful, is then you're trying to like wade through this table, trying to work out like, well, what role do I need to do the things I'm trying to do? Good roles should be somewhat intuitive, and there should be a small number of them. And they should relate to something like some intuitive concept of responsibility. Like I should be able to have a sense for, oh yeah, I have this role, I can probably do these things. And if it tells me that this role needs admin, this particular permission needs an admin role, then that should seem reasonable. Now the final one I have here is one I think isn't often spoken about in the context of roles and role-based access control. So the problem is if you hold these first 2 points, small number of roles, and they've got they should be relatively intuitive. At this point it can become very hard to really to have the sufficient amount of granularity inside an application, to be able to specify who can do what inside an app. But the pattern we've seen time and time again is that instead of just adding new roles to try and capture different levels of granularity, you can often apply roles to a specific resource. So think about, again, in say GitHub or GitLab, you can, you maybe have a small number of roles, but you can apply them to organizations, you can apply them to teams, to sub-teams or groups in the case of GitLab, you can apply them to repositories. And so you only need a small number of roles, but then when you apply them to a team or a sub-team, you can get pretty granular without really needing to try and have this like proliferation of roles. So there is another very, very common access control system called ABAC. ABAC stands for Attribute-Based Access Control. And as the name suggests, the idea is you control access, you define permissions based on attributes of either, say, the user or the resource or both, right? So we might say that users can read documents if those documents are in the same project as the user, right? So I'm checking these two attributes on either one. Or conversely, we might say that only staff can read protected documents. These would be some examples of attribute-based controls. In some ways, attribute-based access control is a generalization of roles. Like the example I just gave around projects is very similar to what I was saying about roles. But generally, what happens here is it can be very, very powerful. It can allow you to do some very granular stuff. But if you use poorly, it's kind of going back into that, having lots of roles or having lots of permissions and having a very opaque system that's hard to understand. So, for me, it's not really about like, should you use RBAC or ABAC? The important part for me is to describe first the relationships that users have to the data. So, things like belong to a project or they created the document. Those help you to define, to have like some of the basic properties in place. And from there, if you do need to do more granularity, you can differentiate by responsibilities using roles. And like finally, if there is something like a protected document that maybe requires a different role, then like attributes can come into play there. So really, it's not so much about like, do you need RBAC or do you need ABAC? It's really a case of just like, can you describe the permission system you want to? Okay, so that's the kind of main content I wanted to cover on the the basic access control patterns from the high level. What I actually want to do now is kind of dive into a demo and show you some code around applying some of those patterns, some of those properties inside a Django application. And the sort of authorization and enforcement and stuff is powered through OSO, which I'll give a little introduction to. But again, I do want to sort of emphasize that I feel like obviously I'm a little bit biased in this, that OSO I think makes it very, very clear and easy to see what's happening with those permission systems, but the patterns I'm applying can be used anywhere. So my application that I'm using for this demo is a little expenses application. So imagine it's a B2B SaaS app. It allows companies to go in and view and manage expenses and that kind of thing. But it's a very, very simple Django application. We have a few data models that are depicted here. So for example, there are organizations. Users can belong to organizations. We also have expenses. Expenses are inside a category, and categories are inside organizations. So for a company, they have different categories, say like food and travel of expenses, and those expenses belong to that. And so these are kind of the main things I'm going to be writing my permissions over. So what I want to get to by the endpoint of this, I want to do some permissions, and I'm trying to relate these to, I think, intuitive things that you'd expect to see in an application like this. So for example, I think naturally users should be able to see their own expenses. We want to have some concept of being able to see expenses inside an organization, because I think that's kind of like one of the core functionalities of the app. And I also want to show a pattern that can come up quite a lot in B2B apps in general, or just applications in general, which is where instead of just applying necessarily roles like inside an organization, you maybe have roles which are applying across like a different dimension. So we're going to show it for the categories. So maybe you have an auditor who can see expenses from multiple organizations. Maybe they're in or an accounting, a third-party accountant who can see multiple accounts. So as I said, we're going to be using OSO as like the core backing to do authorization. So OSO is a open source policy engine for authorization. And so what I mean by that, the policy is where you express your authorization logic. So all of the patterns I've just been talking about are expressed through OSO policies, which are written in a language called Polar. And that's the language here. And I'm going to, in a second, I'm going to go and walk through the syntax of this more directly. But the kind of rule I've written here is saying, a user can view an expense if the user is a staff member. So you express your authorization logic in a policy, and then you use the OSO libraries, which is available for multiple languages, and we also have some specific framework integrations. And you add that to your application, which does the the actual enforcement of the authorization. So in the case of Django, for example, there's an authorize method that takes in a request and makes that authorization decision. But we're not going to focus so much on the enforcement piece. As I said, this is not so much about looking at OSO and the kind of authorization enforcement there, but really I just want to walk through, I'm going to use the policy language here as a way to sort of convey the different patterns I'm applying and how I'm representing the logic in this Django application. Okay, so I'm going to dive into the demo now. So, okay, so first of all, actually, let's go to the, so here's my Django application. It is incredibly bare bones. I can log in, for example, as the user Alice, and it welcomes me. Welcome, Alice. Your company is Bar Inc. and you're the CEO. And right now it's not showing that I have any expenses. And the reason this is because we're using OSO to decide whether or not to show me an expense. It's deciding, is Alice allowed to see a particular expense or not? And if not, it's been hidden from display. And right now I have an empty policy, an empty OSO policy, which means by default everything's been denied. And so what I now need to do in order to be able to add access is to write some rules to specify who is allowed to do what in my application. And so the convention we have for those is that they take the format of an allow rule. So I write allow, and it takes as inputs a user, an action, and a resource. And then I can say under which conditions a user should be allowed to do this action on a resource. So this language polar is actually a declarative logic-based programming language. So this kind of looks like a method, but it's actually a little bit different. It's more about pattern matching. And so what this is doing is saying, well, the first input is right now it's just a variable user. I can say the action must be a read action. So I can just match it directly on the string read. And the objects I'm actually doing authorization over are the objects being passed from Python. So in here, I'm writing polar language here, but the language itself has semantics for application data. So for example, I can say that this resource is really an expense. And further than that, I can actually type check and say it must be an expense. And this is the namespace model coming from the Django application. So let's start off with something incredibly broad and say, for example, the user's username is Alice. If I go ahead and save that policy and go back to my application, I can now see that Alice can see absolutely everything, all my expenses across food and travel and tech for food and bar. All right, it's a little bit too permissive. So let's go back to what we wanted to add in the first place. We said we wanted to users can see their own expenses. So just now when I did user.username equals Alice, that was me actually directly accessing those attributes from the user objects that was getting passed in from Django. And just like with the expenses, I can actually type check this as well. So I can say this must be an expenses user. So just like I was reading the username checking that it was the string Alice, I can check that the owner field on the expense is this current user. So I go and update that rule. I can go back. And cool. Alice can just see Alice's. If I go log into someone else, say Cora can just see Cora's expenses. So we sort of implemented a pretty straightforward. This is more like an ABAC style policy, right? We're saying the users can see if they're the expenses owner. Now, one thing I'll point out, so I was saying this language is a declarative logic-based programming language. And part of what that means is that if I write multiple rules, I'm not really trying to tell I'm not trying to tell the application how to execute those. I'm sort of just defining what I sort of think or know to be true. And so in this case, I'm saying users, this is me asserting users can see their own expenses. And now it's down to the OSO policy engine to sort of evaluate that and provision access. So if I was to add another rule which says, maybe the expense owner's username is Alice. So users can read an expense if the owner's username is Alice. Either of these two things can be true. So if I go back and refresh, Cora can see her own expenses, but she can also see, everyone can see Alice's. So that's what I'm getting here. So as I add multiple rules, any of these ones can match. All right, so that was our first rule we wanted to write. The next one we wanted to do was talk about having some concept of users inside an organization being able to do certain things. So I'm going to flick to my Django models just to kind of look at the data model we have, and you'll probably see these. This is a pretty straightforward Django looking model. We have our expenses, some fields, users, many-to-many organizations and categories, and so on and so on. And so this many-to-many user to organizations is the one we're going to be using first of all. So we want users can see expenses in their organization. So the first thing I might do is write a new rule to say whether or not we think a user is in an organization. And this again takes in a user, and it's also going to take in an organization. And we'll say user is in the organization if the user is in the organization's members. Okay, and now I have this rule. I can use it inside to make authorization decisions. So I kind of have my first piece of logic around this relationship being in an organization. And I'm going to use this to decide what expenses people can see. So allow user to read an expense if the user in org. So I'm going to use the, I'm deferring to this. I'm going to query this rule. Like it's kind of like calling another method in some ways. Takes in the user, and then it takes in the expense. So actually, the expense doesn't directly have an organization. We'll see. The expense has a category, and categories have organizations. So it's taking the expense, category, organization. So now I have that in place. I refresh, and I can see indeed Cora can see all of the expenses for just this organization. And we might decide this is a little bit overly permissive again, because actually not everyone inside the organization should see all expenses. So maybe we'll add some additional constraints here, which says it's not that you must be in the organization, but we also want the fact that let's say the user's title is the CEO. So only the CEO of the organization can see all these expenses. And so here we go. For Cora, it's fine. If I log back in as Alice, as the CEO, I can see these things. So this pattern is kind of interesting because it's something, it's sort of a relationship. It's, I could maybe achieve this with something like a role. Maybe instead of a CEO, there should be a role on the organization. So we're kind of combining some roles and attribute based here. The final one I wanted to do was, as I said, maybe sometimes you don't necessarily have all your roles are inside a single organization. You want somebody who's like a third-party person. So I'm going to log in now as France. So we see France is an auditor for food at Food Industries and an auditor for travel at Bar Inc. So we want them to have this different slicing of data where they can see just two specific categories across those two organizations. So we can do the same thing again. So what do we want? We want users can see expenses that they are the auditor for. So first of all, we have user in, let's say user in cat role. We'll take a user, we'll take a role name, and we'll take a category. And this time we'll do something very similar, but this time we need to work over slightly different data. So this role, we've actually added the role to this many-to-many relationship. So category member is our sort of through table on a many-to-many relationship between users and categories. So in Django, for example, what you can do, when you specify many-to-many relationship, it will kind of generate by default for you this sort of intermediate table, but you can add it explicitly with this through relationship, which allows you to add these additional fields onto it. And in this case, the field I want to add on is a role. So I'm saying that the users have this relationship to categories. They can be a member of a category, but not just that. That relationship has an additional value, which I'm calling a role. This is super powerful because it means that a user can have potentially many different roles across many categories. But it means I need to do something a little bit different here. So I need to say the category member is in the category members. Wait, this is category member rather. So I'm trying to use this intermediate table. And I just need to make sure that first the category member role is equal to the role name we're looking for, and that the member that the category member sort of table refers to is the user. And again, now that I have this in place, I can do something very similar to before. I can write my allow rule. But instead of just this user and org, I'm using my new rule to say the user must have the auditor role for the expense category. I should point out at this point, actually, there's another very powerful thing going on, which I've done a couple of times here, which is that I'm deciding access to an expense based on the category it's in or the organization it's in. And so the really nice and powerful thing about this is we haven't had to assign different roles or levels to these expenses. We're sort of directly checking on the properties of the expense. So if I add that, and here we go. So we can see all of the food expenses for food industries and all of the travel expenses for Bar Inc. Okay, so there we have it. So there's a couple of extra things I want to point out here, and really like some of the power of this approach. For now, I'm going to log back in as, let's say, Cora. So, I already did this one earlier. Maybe Alice instead. All right, I'm going to log back in as Alice, and one of the really nice things we can do here is, like, suppose I'm going to first look up the Alice user. So if I get username equals to Alice, cool, that's my Alice object. So imagine Alice has just been assigned, a new role as the auditor for Foo Inc. for food for some reason. So let me get that category as well. So food. And this should be name equals food, organization ID, I think it's 1. Yeah, that looks good. So the category is for food at food industries. Okay, so what I can now do, I can take that category. I can get the members for it, which is this many-to-many object. So it's sort of referring to members of this category, and I'm going to add Alice to it. There's one extra thing I need to do here, which is actually specify those fields, because I added those extra fields into the relationship. I need to tell it what to do with those. So I'm going to say that I want the many-to-many field role to take the value of auditor, and that would help. Okay, cool. So you can see I've inserted into the table. I've added Alice as an auditor of food. Now the cool thing is, now that I've done that, of course Alice has access to all of the food expenses in food industries. So my policy is actually incredibly dynamic right now. My rules can stay somewhat static. Like I've pretty much expressed all the authorization logic I need to right here. But if I, for example, assign someone to a new category, move someone around, change ownership, like anything changes inside my application, those permissions are updating immediately, dynamically based on what's in the database. So I don't need to worry about something getting out of sync or having to make sure that if I have some separate permissions table that I have it up to date. I'm driving it all from the data that's existing in my application that users would be expecting to manage in the application already, right? Like, if I'm moving organization or I'm changing role or something like that inside a company, you'd expect that to be something reflected immediately. There's one other nice thing I want to point out, which is the way that this would be sort of efficiently implemented. So I've been showing you the polar policy that I've written for this. One of the nice things that the OSO library actually does is, so here are some of the SQL queries, and I've already copy and pasted one of these and formatted it a little bit nicer. But so, for example, here's the kind of policy we're getting, the kind of SQL statement that's actually been executed behind the scenes. So it's taking those complex conditions. You can be inside the right organization. You need to either be inside. Maybe it's that you're a member of the organization. Maybe it's that you have a particular role inside a category. Maybe it's that you're expense owner. It's actually taking all those conditions and pushing them right down to the database layer, so that the filtering of all the expenses is happening directly on those conditions, like at the database level. So this is, so one of the, this is one of the benefits of using OSO is that you don't need to worry about, writing these SQL statements or filtering. These are all being generated through the OSO policy engine as it goes through and matches these rules. So every time I add one, those kind of constraints are getting pushed down to the database layer. Okay. So yeah, just to sum up again, I think the really powerful thing that's going on here is expressing authorization directly over the data model. I think once you do that, it can become relatively easy to implement a very, very fine-grained, very powerful permission system. You know, the ones I was showing there was mostly for just read access, but to extend those out to multiple different actions and permissions and things like that is a really very straightforward step. I think the nice thing here is, again, it's not really about is it RBAC or ABAC. It's just trying to express things in an intuitive way, in a way that makes sense. Like it's about relationships people have to the data and controlling access that way. And again, I'm a little bit biased on this, but in my opinion, what we've been trying to do with OSO is make it possible to do all of these things in as clean and consistent way as possible. So you've seen the policy syntax, you've seen that I'm able to write directly over my Django models and look up attributes in the way that I would in Python apps, without needing to worry about things like, how is the filtering actually done in the database layer and things like that. If you're interested in finding out more about OSO, I've got some links here. So you can find out more about us, the company, at osohq.com. We have a bunch of blog posts there as well. Specifically, we did a lot of work on Django recently and wrote up some of the stuff there. We've got the full docs guides for the various languages we support and writing policies and things like that on docs.osohq.com. And the other one I really want to draw attention to, we have a sort of growing Slack community for people for this open source ecosystem around that we're building. And really, if you're interested in anything from just general authorization permissions to what we're building specifically with OSO, I'd recommend you come join us there. And yeah, link to our GitHub. As I said, all of the stuff I've been showing you is part of the open source OSO library.